We were standing in our son's beautiful new dining room, admiring the granite countertops, when my husband excused himself to find a bathroom. He came back 4 minutes later, found me by the dessert table, leaned in close enough that no one else could hear and whispered, "We have to go." "No. Don't make a scene." I'd been married to Raymond for 42 years. In all that time I had never once heard that particular tone in his voice. Not fear exactly, but something colder and more controlled than fear. The sound of a man who had just understood something he couldn't yet say out loud in a room full of people smiling and holding champagne glasses. I set my plate down without finishing my slice of cake. We were in the car before I even asked him why. "I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, where are you watching from and how did you find this channel? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it genuinely means the world to me. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. My name is Raymond Pierce. My friends call me Dot. My husband spent 35 years underwriting mortgages before he retired, the kind of career that teaches a man to read a loan document the way most people read a stop sign, automatically without needing to think twice about it. I used to tease him for never fully leaving that job behind, the way he'd absently correct a waiter's math or notice a typo in a wedding program nobody else caught. I found it endearing mostly right up until the afternoon that same old habit walked him into our son's home office, looking for nothing more than a bathroom, and walked him straight into paperwork that would nearly cost us our own house. He hadn't gone looking for trouble that day. He'd simply glanced down at a stack of documents sitting open on the desk, the way he'd glanced at 10,000 documents over the course of his career, and found his own name printed clearly across the top of a loan neither of us had ever applied for. Beneath it sat a signature that looked, at a passing glance, exactly like his. It wasn't. Raymond told me later that his first instinct standing in that office wasn't panic at all. It was the particular professional stillness of a man who'd spotted a forged signature enough times in his career to recognize one instantly, even on paperwork bearing his own name. He'd only gone looking for a bathroom, the same errand that sends anyone wandering down an unfamiliar hallway at a party, following what he thought was a closed door near the end of the corridor before realizing it opened into a small home office instead. A handsome room, Whitney's careful decorating evident even here. A mahogany desk positioned beneath a window, a leather chair that still smelled faintly new. He was about to step back out and try another door when a stack of papers on the desk's corner caught his eye, simply because the letterhead at the top was familiar to him in a way almost nothing else in that unfamiliar house had been. Meridian Trust Home Lending. Raymond had underwritten loans for 3 different companies over his career, but he'd spent his final 11 working years at a firm that had, at various points, partnered closely enough with Meridian that he recognized their document formatting the way you'd recognize a relative's handwriting. Not consciously, just immediately before his mind had even caught up to why. He told me he almost walked past it entirely. It was the name at the top of the first page that stopped him. Applicant, Raymond A. Pierce. He said he stood there for a long moment, genuinely confused rather than alarmed at first, certain there had to be some ordinary explanation. Perhaps Adam had listed him as a reference, or the paperwork belonged to some entirely different Raymond Pierce, a name common enough that a coincidence wasn't impossible. He picked up the top page to look more closely, and that was when the confusion sharpened into something considerably colder. It was a home equity line of credit application dated 4 months earlier listing our house. The house Raymond and I had owned outright for 11 years, paid off in full the year he retired, the one asset in our lives neither of us had ever imagined putting at any kind of risk again, as collateral. $340,000. Approved, funded, and closed 2 months after the application date, according to the final page of the stack, which was, Raymond realized with a growing, sick clarity, a settlement statement showing exactly where those funds had gone. A down payment. On this house. The one we were currently standing in, admiring granite countertops in. He told me his hands had gone cold holding those pages, and that his mind, trained by 35 years of exactly this kind of work, moved almost mechanically to the one detail that would tell him everything. The signature line at the bottom of the application itself looked like his signature. I want to be clear about that because it matters enormously to understanding how close this came to going undetected entirely. Whoever had produced it had clearly practiced, had clearly studied Raymond's actual signature closely enough to replicate the general shape and rhythm of it. The particular slant of the R, the way his handwriting tightened toward the end of Pierce the way it always had since he was young. To anyone else in the world, myself included, it would have passed without a second glance. But Raymond had reviewed thousands of signatures across his career, cross-checking them against verification samples with the specific trained eye of a man whose entire job depended on catching exactly this kind of discrepancy. He noticed immediately that the pen pressure was wrong, too even, too careful, lacking the small natural variations his own signature always carried after decades of writing it thousands of times without thinking. He noticed the P was formed slightly differently than he'd formed it his entire adult life. A detail so small I doubt I could have identified it myself even staring directly at both signatures side by side. He knew, standing alone in that office with the party's laughter and music still drifting faintly down the hallway, that he had never signed this document. He knew with the same immediate certainty that whoever had signed it in his name had done so carefully enough and successfully enough that a bank had approved over $300,000 against our home without either of us ever once being contacted, verified, or informed. He told me afterward that his mind moved, in that moment, through the obvious possibilities with the same methodical pace he'd have applied to any file crossing his desk professionally. Identity theft by a stranger seemed unlikely, given that whoever had done this clearly knew our address, our home's paid-off status, and apparently had access to a document detailed enough to forge his signature convincingly. That narrowed the possibilities considerably, in a direction he didn't want to look at directly yet, standing there with our son's laughter still audible from the dining room down the hall. He set the papers down exactly as he'd found them, careful not to disturb their order, and walked back out into the party with an expression he told me he'd worked hard to keep steady, though I remember now, thinking back, that something in his face had already shifted by the time he found me at the dessert table. 4 minutes. That's how long he was gone, according to the clock on my own phone, which I checked afterward almost obsessively, trying to understand how something that altered the entire shape of our lives could have unfolded in a window of time so brief I hadn't even finished my slice of cake. "We have to go," he said. "Now. Don't make a scene." I didn't ask him why in that moment. Something in his voice made clear that whatever question I had would need to wait until we were somewhere private, and I trusted him completely, the way I'd trusted him through 42 years of marriage, enough to simply set down my plate and follow him toward the door without a single word of protest. We said our goodbyes to Adam quickly, Raymond citing a headache that wasn't entirely a lie, and I remember Whitney's smile as she hugged me goodbye at the door. Warm, easy, entirely unbothered, the smile of a woman with absolutely no idea that her father-in-law had just spent 4 minutes standing in her home office holding proof of exactly what she'd done. Raymond didn't say a word until we'd pulled out of Adam and Whitney's driveway, out of the new subdivision with its identical mailboxes and freshly sodded lawns, and merged onto the highway that would carry us the 2 hours back to our own house. I sat beside him in a silence that felt, by the 10-minute mark, almost unbearable, watching his hands grip the steering wheel with a tension I recognized from exactly 2 other moments in our marriage. The night his father died, and the morning we got the call about Adam's car accident his sophomore year of college. "Raymond," I finally said, "you're frightening me. Please just tell me what happened in that office." He was quiet another long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful, deliberate evenness that I understood even then was costing him considerable effort to maintain. "I found paperwork," he said. "A loan application. My name on it. A home equity line of credit, $340,000, secured against our house." I remember laughing briefly, a short, disbelieving sound that had nothing to do with humor at all. "That's not possible." We don't have any loans against the house. We paid it off years ago. You'd know if you'd signed something like that. I didn't sign it, Raymond said. That's exactly the problem. My signature is on it. I didn't put it there. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the particular disorienting vertigo of trying to absorb information that simply refused to arrange itself into anything coherent. I don't understand, I said. If you didn't sign it, how would your signature be on it at all? Someone forged it, Raymond said, and I heard in the flatness of his voice that he'd already moved past disbelief himself, already arrived at a conclusion he clearly didn't want to say aloud any sooner than necessary. Convincingly enough to get past a bank's verification process. Well enough that I only caught it myself because I've spent 35 years learning exactly what to look for in a signature that isn't genuine. Who would do that? I asked, though some cold, unwelcome part of me had already begun assembling an answer I didn't want to reach on my own. Raymond didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, and I watched him work through, I understood later, the same careful reluctance to name a suspect that had kept him quiet in that office 4 minutes rather than storming back out into the party immediately. The closing documents, he finally said, showed exactly where the money went. It funded the down payment on Adam and Whitney's house. The house we were just standing in. I felt something in my chest go very still, the particular stillness that arrives just before a genuine shock fully lands. Adam wouldn't do that, I said. He would never forge your signature. He's our son. I don't think it was Adam, Raymond said quietly. I think Adam has no idea any of this happened at all. We drove another 20 minutes in silence after that, both of us, I think, needing time simply to sit with the shape of what he'd said before either of us could productively discuss it further. I found myself staring out at the darkening highway, running back through the past year of our lives, searching for anything that might explain how something like this could have happened without either of us noticing. It was somewhere around the 50-mile marker that I remembered the form. Raymond, I said slowly, do you remember back in the spring when Whitney asked you to fill out that medical power of attorney? For emergencies, she said, in case anything ever happened while you were visiting them and she needed to make decisions on your behalf at a hospital. I watched him go very still beside me, his hands tightening further on the wheel. I remember, he said. I signed it in front of a notary at her insistence. She said it was standard practice, that plenty of families do it as a courtesy for aging parents visiting from out of state. You signed your name several times on that form, I said, the memory sharpening now as I spoke it aloud. I remember because you complained about it afterward, joked that you'd written your own signature so many times in one sitting, your hand cramped up. Raymond didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter and more devastated than I'd yet heard from him that evening. She had multiple genuine samples of my signature, he said slowly, working through it the way I imagine he once worked through a suspicious loan file professionally. Notarized samples written naturally in my own hand, provided voluntarily because I trusted her completely as our son's wife. That's more than enough material for anyone with patience and a reasonable amount of skill to practice a convincing forgery from. I felt tears come suddenly, unexpectedly, not from grief yet but from a kind of furious, disoriented violation I hadn't fully anticipated. She used something we gave her out of love, I said. To steal from us. We don't know that for certain yet, Raymond said, though I could hear, even in his careful qualification, that he didn't fully believe his own caution anymore. We know a forged document exists. We don't yet know everything else. What do we do? I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected, some old, stubborn resolve settling into place beneath the shock. We can't simply go back to that house and confront her at her own housewarming party. And I won't accuse our son of anything until we understand exactly what he does and doesn't know. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, I heard in his voice the same careful, deliberate tone he must have once used delivering difficult news to loan applicants across 35 years of that career. We need a lawyer, he said. Someone who understands exactly what we're looking at and exactly how serious this actually is before we do anything that can't be undone. He glanced at me once, briefly, in the dim light of the dashboard. And I think whatever we find, we need to be prepared for the possibility that our son is going to need us more than he's ever needed us in his adult life, once he learns the truth about what his wife has actually done. I reached over and took his hand on the console between us, the same hand that had held mine through 42 years of far smaller crises than this one, and I understood, sitting there in that quiet, dark car, that whatever came next, we were no longer simply protecting our own house. We were preparing to save our son from something he didn't yet know he needed saving from at all. We didn't sleep much that first night, and by 8 the next morning, Raymond was already on the phone with an old colleague from his underwriting days, asking for a recommendation for an attorney who specialized in mortgage fraud and forged financial documents. The name that came back, called in with obvious confidence, was Constance Whitfield, a Charlotte-based attorney who'd spent nearly 2 decades handling exactly this kind of case, often involving family members rather than strangers, which Raymond's old colleague noted, delicately, was more common than most people realized. Her office sat in a converted historic building downtown, warm exposed brick and tall windows that felt considerably less clinical than I'd braced myself for, and Constance herself greeted us with a directness I found immediately reassuring. A woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed, who listened to our full account without interrupting once, taking careful notes on a legal pad and handwriting so precise it reminded me, absurdly, of Raymond's own. "I want to make sure I understand the full timeline correctly," she said once we'd finished. "Your daughter-in-law asked you to sign a medical power of attorney back in the spring, correct? And you signed it in the presence of a notary, providing several genuine signature samples in the process." "That's right," Raymond confirmed. "And 4 months ago, a home equity line of credit was opened against your primary residence, using what appears to be a forged version of your signature, funding what the closing documents show as a down payment on a property purchased by your son and his wife." "Yes," I said. "Raymond found the paperwork himself yesterday entirely by accident." Constance set down her pen and studied us both for a long moment, her expression carrying the particular gravity I imagine she'd learned to deploy carefully after years of delivering difficult assessments to frightened clients. "I want to be direct with you both because I think that's what you need right now more than reassurance. What you're describing, if confirmed, constitutes forgery and likely identity theft under North Carolina law, in addition to bank fraud at the federal level, given that a federally regulated lending institution was deceived into approving and funding this loan. This isn't a civil misunderstanding we can simply write a letter about. If this is what it appears to be, it's a serious criminal matter. We're not trying to destroy our son's marriage over a misunderstanding," Raymond said carefully. "We need to be certain first. Completely certain." "That's exactly the right instinct," Constance said, "and it's precisely why I'd recommend our next step before anything else happens. I want to bring in a forensic document examiner, someone who can compare the signature on that HELIC application against verified genuine samples of your signature with proper scientific rigor, rather than relying solely on your own professional judgment, however well-founded that judgment likely is. If we're going to move forward with this, particularly if it eventually involves law enforcement, we need evidence that holds up to the strictest possible scrutiny." She recommended a specialist named Dr. Harold Voss, a semi-retired forensic examiner who'd testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases across the state, and within the same week, we'd secured copies of both the HELIC signature and several verified genuine samples of Raymond's own handwriting, spanning documents from the past several years. Dr. Voss's preliminary findings came back 9 days later, delivered to Constance's office in a report considerably more technical than I fully understood, though the summary at the front was plain enough for anyone to follow. The signature on the HELIC application showed, in Dr. Voss's professional assessment, significant indicators of simulation rather than genuine execution, inconsistent pen pressure, unnatural pauses in stroke formation, and structural deviations in specific letter formations that, taken together, fell well outside the natural variation range expected even across different genuine signings by the same person. In plain terms, Constance told us once she'd reviewed the full report herself, Dr. Voss is confident to a professional and legally defensible standard that this signature is not authentic. Combined with the medical power of attorney providing genuine samples your daughter-in-law had direct access to, and the fact that the loan proceeds funded a property she and your son purchased, I think we have more than enough to move forward carefully. What does moving forward actually look like? I asked her. Constance considered the question for a long moment before answering. There are two separate tracks here, and I'd recommend pursuing them somewhat in parallel. First, on the financial side, we need to work with the lending institution directly to dispute the fraudulent loan and begin the process of having it reversed or discharged, which protects your home from any risk of foreclosure or collection action tied to a debt you never legitimately incurred. That process can move relatively quickly once fraud is properly documented, though banks are understandably cautious and thorough about it. She paused, choosing her next words more carefully. The second track is considerably more delicate, and it's the one I think matters most to both of you personally. We need to understand exactly what your son knows, and exactly what your daughter-in-law's full financial situation actually looks like, before either of you decides how and when to bring this to him directly. We think Adam has no idea, Raymond said. He's told us himself more than once that the down payment came from an inheritance Whitney received from her grandmother. Constance made a note of that, her expression carefully neutral. I'd recommend we look into that claim as well quietly before you have any conversation with your son at all. If that inheritance doesn't exist or doesn't match what he's been told, that's going to matter enormously to how this entire situation actually unfolded, and to how much your son has been deceived versus simply kept in the dark. I sat with that thought for a long moment, feeling something heavy and sad settle over the cautious relief of finally having a clear plan. You think she lied to him too, I said. Not just to us. I think, Constance said carefully, that forging a father-in-law's signature to secure a fraudulent loan isn't typically the behavior of someone who's been fully honest with her own husband about where the family's money is actually coming from. I'd rather we find out the full truth before either of you says a single word to your son, so that when you do have that conversation, you're able to tell him everything at once, clearly, rather than in difficult pieces over time. We left her office that afternoon with a private investigator's number in hand, someone Constance trusted to look quietly into Whitney's actual financial history, and a plan that felt, for the first time since that whispered warning at the party, like something we could actually walk through steadily rather than simply reacting to in shock. I keep thinking about Adam, I told Raymond in the car afterward. About what this is going to do to him once he finally understands. I know, Raymond said quietly. But I think what would do far more damage is letting him keep believing a lie for one day longer than necessary. Whatever this costs him emotionally, I think he deserves to know the truth about his own life. I nodded, though I found myself driving home that evening, praying quietly that whatever we uncovered next might somehow be less devastating than what I already feared it would be. The private investigator Constance recommended was a woman named Patricia Ostrowski, a former state banking examiner who'd left that career 8 years earlier to work independently, specializing, she told us during our first call, in exactly this particular flavor of family financial fraud. It's more common than anyone wants to admit, she said, her voice carrying the same unhurried, matter-of-fact competence I'd come to appreciate in Constance. People assume strangers are the danger. In my experience, it's almost always someone already sitting at the dinner table. I asked her to start with the notarized power of attorney itself, the document that had apparently supplied every genuine signature sample needed to forge the rest. Raymond remembered the details with the particular clarity of a man replaying a moment he now understood mattered enormously. A Sunday afternoon back in April, Whitney arriving at our house with the forms already prepared, explaining warmly that it was simply a precaution, something she'd read about online, standard practice for adult children to have in place for aging parents who traveled to visit. She had it all set up very smoothly, Raymond told Patricia during our first meeting at Constance's office. A notary already scheduled to come to the house that same afternoon, the forms filled out except for my signature lines. I remember thinking it was thoughtful of her, honestly. She said something about wanting to make sure I'd be properly cared for if anything ever happened while I was staying with them. How many times did you sign that day? Patricia asked. Raymond thought about it carefully. Several times. The original plus what she said were copies for our own records and one for Adam's file as well, she mentioned. I remember joking about it afterward, that my hand had cramped up from writing my own name so many times in one sitting. Patricia made a note, her expression carefully neutral in the way I was learning to recognize from everyone involved in this process, the professional stillness of people trained not to react visibly to information that clearly troubled them. That's considerably more genuine signature material than most forgers ever get handed voluntarily, she said. Most people trying to replicate a signature convincingly have to work from a single sample, maybe two, usually captured secretly rather than provided outright. Whoever did this had, by your own account, at least 4 or 5 clean natural examples to study and practice from, obtained with your full trust and cooperation. It took Patricia less than a week to track down the notary who'd handled that Sunday appointment, a mobile notary service Whitney had booked through an app, the kind of convenient, forgettable transaction that left behind exactly the paper trail Patricia needed. The notary herself, a pleasant woman named Charisse Combs who ran her small mobile business out of her own car, remembered the appointment clearly once Patricia explained she was assisting with a legal matter, though she grew visibly uneasy once she understood the nature of what might have happened afterward. I notarized exactly what was in front of me that day, Charisse told Patricia, according to the notes she later shared with us. Mr. Pierce signed in my presence, I verified his identification, everything was completely proper on my end. I have no way of knowing what anyone did with copies of a document after I've already completed my part of it. That detail, small as it seemed, mattered enormously to Constance once Patricia reported it back. This tells us the fraud almost certainly happened after that appointment, using copies rather than any manipulation of the notarization process itself, Constance explained. Which means Whitney likely photographed or scanned the signed documents at some point that same day, or shortly after, giving herself a clean, high-quality reference to work from at her own leisure, with no time pressure and no risk of being observed. Patricia's investigation over the following 2 weeks uncovered something else. Something that shifted my understanding of the timeline considerably. The medical power of attorney had been signed in April. The fraudulent HELIC application, according to the bank's own records once Constance formally requested them as part of the fraud dispute, had been submitted just 3 weeks later, in early May. A turnaround, Patricia noted, that suggested considerable planning and preparation had already been underway well before that Sunday afternoon appointment, rather than the idea occurring to Whitney only after she happened to acquire genuine signature samples. This wasn't opportunistic, Patricia told us during a follow-up meeting, laying out a timeline she'd assembled carefully on a single printed page. The speed of the application, 3 weeks after acquiring the signatures, tells me the loan paperwork was likely already prepared, or nearly prepared, before she ever came to your house that Sunday. The power of attorney appointment wasn't a separate, unrelated act of family planning. I believe it was arranged specifically to obtain what she needed to complete a fraud she'd already begun setting in motion. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something cold and clarifying settle over the last, faint hope I think I'd still been quietly carrying that some smaller, more forgivable explanation might eventually surface. This hadn't been a moment of weakness or panic. This had been planned deliberately months in advance, using an act of apparent thoughtfulness toward her own father-in-law as the exact mechanism required to execute it. There's one more thing, Patricia said, and something in her tone told me before she even continued, that whatever came next would matter considerably to everything ahead of us. While I was tracing the timeline around the power of attorney appointment, I found something in Whitney's own financial history that I think changes the shape of why any of this happened at all. I'd like your permission to keep digging in that direction specifically, because I believe the down payment on the house may not be the only place this money went. Raymond and I exchanged a look across Constance's conference table, both of us understanding, I think, that whatever Patricia had glimpsed was likely to be considerably worse than a single fraudulent loan. Dig, Raymond told her. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I need to understand exactly what my son has actually been living inside of this whole time. Patricia called us back to Constance's office 10 days later, and I remember walking in that afternoon, feeling a particular dread I hadn't quite felt during our previous meetings. The specific unease of sensing that whatever came next would be harder to hear than anything before it, simply because Patricia's voice on the phone scheduling the meeting had carried none of its usual brisk professional ease. She laid out a folder on the table, thinner than I expected given how consequential its contents apparently were, and began walking us through what she'd found with the same careful, unhurried precision Raymond had once brought to his own underwriting work. You mentioned Adam believes the down payment came from an inheritance Whitney received from her late grandmother, Patricia said. I want to start there because it turned out to be considerably easier to disprove than I initially expected. She slid a document across the table. This is a certified copy of Whitney's family genealogy, compiled through public vital records. Her maternal grandmother, Doris Sorrell, passed away in 2019, 5 years before this house purchase, and left an estate valued, according to the probate filing, at just under $11,000, split between Whitney and 2 siblings. Her paternal grandmother, Eleanor Sorrell, is very much alive, currently residing in an assisted living facility in Georgia, and according to the facility's own billing records that I was able to verify through entirely legal public channels, has no meaningful assets remaining beyond what covers her own care. So there's no inheritance at all, I said slowly, though I'd already begun understanding, hearing Patricia's careful framing, that this confirmation was likely only the beginning of whatever she'd actually come to tell us. There's no inheritance that could have funded a down payment anywhere close to what your home equity line provided, Patricia said. Which raises the obvious question of why Whitney needed to invent one at all, rather than simply telling Adam the truth about where the money actually came from. I don't believe that's a story someone tells casually, or without a specific reason for needing the real source hidden. She turned to the next section of her folder, and her expression shifted into something more careful still. I did some additional digging into Whitney's personal financial history over the past 2 years, using records that became available once the fraud investigation gave us proper legal standing to request them. Mr. and Mrs. Pierce, I want to prepare you before I share this, because I don't think either of you are going to find it easy to hear. Just tell us, Raymond said quietly. Whitney has an extensive history of online gambling activity, Patricia said, concentrated primarily on sports betting platforms and online poker sites, spanning back at least 3 years based on the account records I was able to trace. The scale of it is significant. Based on bank statement patterns and the handful of account records that became accessible through this investigation, I estimate her losses over that period at somewhere between $55,000 and $65,000, though the true figure could be somewhat higher given how difficult it is to trace funds moved through multiple platforms and accounts. I felt the room tilt slightly, absorbing that number alongside everything else we'd already learned. $60,000, I repeated. Does Adam know any of this? Based on everything I've found, Patricia said carefully, I don't believe he does. The gambling activity appears to have been conducted through accounts and cards kept separate from their shared finances, funded initially through Whitney's own income before her losses grew large enough that she apparently needed another source of money to keep covering them without her husband noticing the gap. Constance leaned forward at that point, drawing the pieces together with the same clear, methodical logic she'd brought to every meeting since we'd first walked into her office. "This gives us the motive behind the forgery," she said. "Whitney needed a substantial sum of money quickly, discreetly, in a way that wouldn't require Adam's direct involvement or awareness. A fraudulent helic against your home, using a forged signature obtained through a document she'd engineered specifically to acquire genuine samples, accomplished exactly that. The down payment on the new house likely served two purposes simultaneously: genuinely funding the purchase Adam believed was happening honestly, while also providing cover and a plausible explanation for where a large sum of money had suddenly appeared from. But that doesn't account for all of it," I said slowly, doing the math myself. "The helic was $340,000. If the gambling debt was $60,000, and the house down payment used considerably more than that. That's precisely the detail I wanted to flag for you both," Patricia said. "Based on the closing documents Constance obtained from the lender, approximately $280,000 of the helic funds went directly and traceably into the home purchase itself, exactly as your son believes. The remaining $60,000 transferred out in several smaller increments over the following 2 months rather than all at once, appears to align closely with the gambling debt timeline I've traced separately. I believe Whitney used a single fraudulent loan to solve two separate problems simultaneously, funding a legitimate-looking down payment for the house she and Adam wanted, while quietly clearing debts she couldn't explain to her own husband any other way." I sat with all of it for a long moment, feeling something considerably more complicated than the anger I'd expected to feel by this point in our investigation. There was anger, certainly sharp and real, at the violation of Raymond's trust and the theft from our own home. But underneath it sat something closer to grief for our son, a young man who believed, right now at that very moment, that his wife's grandmother had left them a generous gift, when the truth was that his own father-in-law's signature had been forged to quietly cover his wife's secret gambling losses while funding the home they now proudly showed off to family and friends. "Adam has no idea what he's actually living inside of," Raymond said quietly, echoing almost exactly what he'd said to Patricia weeks earlier, though his voice now carried the weight of considerably more certainty than hope. "He thinks he married into some kind of good fortune. He has no idea his entire financial foundation is built on fraud and a debt he doesn't even know exists." "I think," Constance said gently, "it's time we talked seriously about exactly how and when you're going to tell him." I looked at Raymond and I understood, meeting his eyes across that conference table, that neither of us had any real appetite left for delaying this conversation any further, whatever pain it was about to cause our son. "Soon," I said, "before she has any more time to hide anything else from him." Constance advised us to take one more careful step before bringing anything to Adam directly, gentle but firm on this point in a way that told me she'd seen families skip it before to their own regret. "I understand the urgency you're both feeling," she said, "but I want you to have one ordinary, unguarded conversation with your son before any of this comes out, simply to hear in his own words exactly what he currently believes about his own finances. Not to trap him. Simply to know with real certainty what we're actually working with." I understood her caution, though it sat uneasily with me, the idea of sitting across from my own son and quietly testing what he knew rather than simply telling him the truth outright. Raymond felt the same discomfort, I think, though we both recognized the wisdom in Constance's advice. If there was even a small possibility Adam knew more than we hoped, or had been complicit in some smaller way we hadn't yet considered, we needed to understand that clearly before we brought him into a confrontation with his own wife. I called Adam the following week and suggested lunch, just the two of us, the kind of casual mother-son visit we'd shared regularly enough over the years that it wouldn't raise any particular suspicion. He met me at a small diner near his office, cheerful and relaxed in a way that made what I was about to do feel considerably heavier than I'd braced myself for. We talked easily at first about his work, about a work trip he had coming up, about how much he and Whitney were enjoying the new house. It was nearly 20 minutes in, once the conversation had settled into its natural, comfortable rhythm, that I found an opening that felt honest rather than manufactured. "I've been meaning to ask," I said, keeping my voice light, curious in the way any mother might be about her son's new financial milestone. "How did you two manage the down payment on such a beautiful house? That's no small amount of money for young people your age." Adam smiled, entirely unguarded, exactly the reaction I'd hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. "Whitney's grandmother left her some money a few years back," he said. "More than either of us expected, honestly. We'd been saving on our own for a while, but her inheritance is what really made the house possible on the timeline we wanted. I still feel a little bad we haven't done more to honor her memory with it, if I'm being honest, given how much it's meant for our future." "That's a generous gift," I said carefully. "Do you know which grandmother that was?" I don't think I ever met either of Whitney's grandmothers myself. "Her mom's mother, I think," Adam said, though something in his phrasing, the slight uncertainty of "I think," told me he'd never actually pressed for more detail than Whitney had offered him. "Whitney doesn't talk about her much. I think the loss was hard on her, so I've never wanted to push for more than she's comfortable sharing." I felt my chest tighten hearing that, understanding with total clarity how easily kindness and respect for someone's grief had become the exact cover that allowed a lie to survive unquestioned for years. Adam hadn't been careless or willfully blind. He'd simply been decent, giving his wife space around a subject he believed was painful for her, never imagining that the space he was offering was actually protecting a fabrication rather than genuine grief. "Has business been good for you two otherwise?" I asked, steering gently toward the broader financial picture without making the question feel pointed. "I know new houses come with all kinds of unexpected expenses." "It's been tight, honestly," Adam admitted, his easy expression flickering slightly for the first time. "Whitney's been managing most of our budgeting. She's always been better with the day-to-day stuff than I am. I know things have felt stretched thinner than I expected given the down payment, but she keeps telling me it's just normal new homeowner adjustment. Furniture, closing costs, that kind of thing." He shrugged, an easy, trusting gesture that broke my heart a little to watch. "I don't love how little I actually understand about our finances most months, if I'm honest, Mom. But she's always handled it, and I've never had a reason not to trust her with it." I drove home from that lunch with a knot in my stomach that hadn't fully loosened by the time I reached our own driveway, and I sat with Raymond that evening walking him through everything Adam had said, watching his own expression tighten with each new detail. "He has no idea," Raymond said quietly once I'd finished. "Not about the inheritance, not about the actual state of their finances, not about any of it. He's simply trusted her completely, the same way I trusted her when I signed that power of attorney." "He's not naive," I said, feeling a protective urgency rise in me on our son's behalf. "He's decent. He gave her space around something he believed was a painful subject. That's not the same thing as being careless." "I know," Raymond said. "I'm not blaming him. I'm grieving for him, honestly, the same way I think you are. He's about to learn that the foundation of his entire adult life together with her has been built on something false, and he had absolutely no way of knowing it, because he trusted the person he loved the way any of us would want to be able to trust the person we married." We sat together in our kitchen a long while that evening, the same kitchen where we'd have to eventually tell our son everything, and I understood, watching Raymond's face in the dim evening light, that whatever came next would require both of us to be steadier than we'd ever needed to be for him before. "When?" I finally asked. "When do we tell him?" "Soon," Raymond said. "But not without a plan for exactly how. I don't want him hearing this in a way that leaves him standing alone in the moment he learns it. I want him to have somewhere solid to stand the instant the ground gives way beneath him." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, and I thought, sitting there, about every difficult truth Raymond had likely delivered across 35 years of underwriting work, the particular skill of telling someone something devastating in a way that still, somehow, left them with a clear path forward rather than simply collapse. I trusted him to find that same steadiness now for our own son, when it mattered more than it ever had in either of our careers. We met with Constance one final time before deciding how to approach Adam, and it was during that meeting that a question arose I hadn't fully considered until she raised it directly, one that shaped everything about how the following weeks would unfold. "I want to walk you through something important," Constance said, spreading a fresh set of papers across her conference table. "Once you tell Adam the truth, you lose control over what happens next. He may confront Whitney immediately before we're ready with everything in place. He may need time to process before he's able to act at all. He may, and I want you to be prepared for this possibility, choose to protect her initially, out of shock or love or simple disbelief, in ways that could complicate the legal process considerably. You're asking whether we trust our own son," Raymond said, an edge of quiet hurt in his voice that I understood completely, because I'd felt the same instinctive defensiveness the moment Constance raised the possibility. "I'm asking you to prepare for every outcome," Constance said gently, "precisely because I believe from everything you've told me about him, that Adam is going to choose you both and choose the truth, once he fully understands it. But grief and shock don't always move in a straight line, even for good, honest people. I've seen spouses defend partners they knew on some level had wronged them terribly, simply because accepting it fully takes time even after the facts are undeniable. We spent the better part of that week deciding exactly how to bring Adam into the truth, weighing several approaches before settling on what felt, to both Raymond and me, like the only option that honored our son properly rather than simply managing him through a difficult conversation. "I don't want to ambush him," I said during one particularly long conversation at our own kitchen table, the same table where we now seemed to be having every significant conversation of this entire ordeal. "I don't want him walking into some kind of meeting where Whitney's also present and he has to process shock and betrayal in the same breath as watching his own parents confront his wife. He deserves to hear it first, privately from us, with time to simply absorb it before anything else happens." Raymond agreed completely. "I think we invite him here," he said. "Just him, no reason given beyond wanting to talk about something important. We lay everything out clearly and completely all at once the way Constance recommended, so he's not left putting pieces together over days or weeks. And then however he needs to respond, we let him respond that way without pushing him toward any particular next step until he's ready for it himself." There was a harder question underneath that plan, one Raymond and I circled for several days before finally addressing directly. What if Adam, once he understood everything, wanted to protect Whitney anyway, at least initially? What if love or shame or simple shock made him hesitate to act as decisively as we hoped he would? "I think," Raymond said finally one evening as we sat together on our back porch, "that we have to separate two things clearly in our own minds before we talk to him. There's what we need to do to protect our own house and our own financial security, which Constance is already handling through the bank dispute process, regardless of anything Adam decides. And there's what Adam needs and deserves as our son, which is the truth delivered with love, and then the freedom to decide for himself how he wants to respond to it on his own timeline without us forcing his hand." "What if he needs more time than we're comfortable with?" I asked. "What if telling him the truth doesn't lead immediately to him confronting her the way we're hoping?" "Then we give him the time," Raymond said simply. "I spent 35 years watching people make devastating financial decisions, sometimes because they were desperate, sometimes because they were dishonest, and I learned a long time ago that the people around them rushing the reckoning rarely helped anyone heal properly from it. If Adam needs a week or a month to fully absorb what his marriage has actually been built on, I intend to give him that time, even if some part of me wants this resolved immediately." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle in me that I recognized gradually as genuine peace rather than simple resignation. Raymond was right, and I understood, hearing him articulate it so clearly, exactly why I'd trusted this man for 42 years with every difficult decision our marriage had ever required. We called Adam that Thursday and asked him to come by Saturday afternoon, telling him only that we wanted to talk about something important, and I heard in his easy, unconcerned agreement, the last few days our son would spend believing his life was built on a foundation considerably more honest than the one he actually stood on. Constance had one final piece of advice before we ended our meeting that week, delivered with the particular gravity of a woman who understood from years of similar cases exactly how much weight the next conversation would carry. "Have everything ready before he arrives," she said. "The forensic report, the timeline Patricia assembled, copies of the actual loan documents. Don't make him take your word for any of it, however much he trusts you. Let him see the proof himself clearly all at once, so there's no ambiguity left for him to wrestle with beyond the simple, devastating truth of what actually happened." I spent that Saturday morning laying out every document carefully on our own kitchen table, the same table where Adam had eaten breakfast 1,000 times as a boy, arranging the evidence in the exact order Constance had recommended, my hands steadier than I expected them to be given how much I dreaded what was about to unfold. Raymond joined me at the table a little before noon, and we sat together in a silence that felt, for the first time in weeks, less like dread and more like readiness. "Whatever he needs," Raymond said quietly, watching the clock. "However long it takes. We're not losing our son over this. We're getting him back from something he never should have been standing inside of in the first place." Adam's car pulled into the driveway a little after 1 o'clock. Adam came in through the back door the way he always had since he was a boy, calling out a cheerful hello before he'd even fully crossed the threshold. And I remember how much that ordinary cheerfulness cost me to hear, knowing what we were about to do to it. "What's going on?" he asked, settling into his usual chair at the table, the same chair he'd occupied for every family dinner of his adult life, before his eyes landed on the papers spread carefully across the surface in front of him. His smile faltered slightly. "This looks serious." "It is," Raymond said, sitting down across from him, his voice steady in exactly the way I'd hoped it would be. "Adam, I need you to listen to everything we're about to tell you before you say anything at all. It's going to be difficult to hear. I need you to let us get through it completely first." Adam's expression shifted into something more guarded, though I could see him trying visibly to hold on to his earlier ease. "Okay," he said slowly. "You're scaring me a little, but okay." Raymond began exactly where it started, walking Adam through that afternoon at the housewarming party, the 4 minutes in the home office, the loan application bearing his name and a signature he'd never made. He laid out Dr. Voss's forensic report next, sliding it across the table, watching Adam's hands pick it up and begin reading with an expression that moved, over the following minutes, from confusion into something considerably darker. "This says the signature is forged," Adam said, his voice tight. "Dad, this is your signature. I've seen your signature my whole life." "It's a very good forgery," Raymond said. "Good enough to fool a bank. Good enough that I only caught it because of 35 years spent looking for exactly that kind of inconsistency. It's not genuine, Adam. I never signed this document." I watched my son's face as the weight of that sentence settled over him, watched him look from the forensic report to the closing statement showing exactly where the funds had gone, watched the particular, sickening moment when disbelief finally gave way to comprehension. "This funded our down payment," he said quietly. "This is the money for our house." "Yes," Raymond said. "But Whitney's grandmother." "There's no inheritance, Adam," I said gently, unable to let him finish that sentence when I already knew with total certainty exactly how it would end. "We had it investigated. Whitney's grandmothers are either still living, or left in a state worth a fraction of what would be needed. The inheritance story isn't true." Adam sat very still for a long moment, staring down at the papers in front of him, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with tears he was clearly fighting hard to hold back. "Then where did the money actually come from?" he asked, though I could see in the way he asked it that some part of him had already begun to suspect the answer before either of us said it aloud. We told him about the power of attorney appointment, about Patricia's investigation into the timeline, about the genuine signature samples that had provided exactly the material needed to forge the rest. Raymond laid out the gambling records last. The estimated $60,000 in losses traced across multiple platforms over 3 years. The pattern of funds moving from the fraudulent Helic into accounts that appeared, according to Patricia's careful tracing, to have covered those debts within 2 months of the loan closing. Adam didn't say anything for a long time after that. He simply sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd once cut up his sandwiches into triangles because he refused to eat them any other shape, and stared at the evidence of his own life rearranging itself in front of him. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has she been gambling?" "At least 3 years based on what Patricia found," I told him gently. "Adam, I don't think this is something she planned out of malice toward you specifically. I think she got into trouble, deep trouble, and made a series of increasingly desperate choices to hide it rather than tell you the truth." "That doesn't make it better," Adam said, and I heard for the first time in that conversation, real anger entering his voice alongside the grief. "She forged your signature, Dad. She put your house at risk. She let me believe a story about her own dead grandmother for 2 years, and she let me sit in that new house feeling grateful for a gift that never existed, while she was secretly gambling away God knows how much money behind my back the entire time we've been married." "We know," Raymond said quietly. "We're not asking you to excuse any of it, Adam. We're telling you the truth because you deserve to know it, and because we needed you to hear it from us together rather than in pieces from somewhere else." Adam put his head in his hands for a long moment, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had settled into a hardness I didn't recognize from him, though I understood immediately it was grief finishing its transformation into resolve. "What happens to the house?" he asked. "To your house, I mean. Are you going to lose it because of this?" "Constance is working with the bank to have the fraudulent loan discharged," Raymond told him. "Given the forensic evidence and the clear pattern of fraud, she believes we have a strong case, though it will take some time to fully resolve. Our house isn't your primary concern right now, Adam. You are." "What do I do?" Adam said, and I heard in that simple question the same lost, searching tone he'd carried as a small boy asking us to explain something too large for him to fully understand on his own. "How do I even begin to process this? I don't even know if I can look at her the same way again, knowing what she's actually done. To our whole marriage." I reached across the table and took my son's hand, the same way I had 1,000 times over his life, through skinned knees and broken hearts and every ordinary crisis of growing up, though nothing had ever demanded quite this much steadiness from either of us before. "You don't have to know all of that today," I told him. "You only have to decide one thing right now if you're ready to decide it. Do you want to confront her with us with everything we've found, or do you need more time before that happens?" Adam was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the evidence still spread across our table, and when he finally answered, his voice had steadied into something I recognized, with a swell of grief and pride arriving together, as exactly his father's voice, the particular calm resolve Raymond brought to every hard decision he'd ever made. "I want to be there," Adam said. "I want to look her in the eye myself when she finally has to explain this. And Dad," he looked up at Raymond directly, "I want you there too. It's your signature she stole. You deserve to be in that room." Raymond nodded slowly, and I watched something pass between father and son in that moment that felt, despite everything, like the beginning of something considerably stronger than what had existed between them before. "Then let's call Constance," Raymond said. "And let's figure out exactly how we're going to do this properly." Constance advised us to let law enforcement handle the confrontation itself rather than staging anything dramatic on our own, a recommendation Adam initially resisted before coming around to understanding why. "I know you want to be the one who says it to her face," Constance told him gently, during the call we made together that same evening. "But I want you protected legally and emotionally through this, Adam, and the safest way to do that is to let a detective be present when the truth is formally laid out, rather than any of you confronting her alone." She connected us within 2 days with Detective Marcus Ford, who specialized in financial fraud cases for the county, a careful, thorough man who reviewed Dr. Voss's forensic report, Patricia's full investigative file, and the bank's own fraud dispute documentation before confirming what Constance had already told us was likely. There was more than sufficient evidence to support formal charges of forgery and identity theft. "I'd like to arrange this carefully," Detective Ford told us, "in a way that gives your family the conversation you clearly need, while also ensuring everything happens properly from a legal standpoint. I can be present along with a partner at the house on a day and time we coordinate together. Adam, if you're comfortable with it, I think it matters that you're the one who initiates the conversation with your wife, with your parents present before we step in formally." Adam agreed, and the following Tuesday, we drove together to the house we'd walked through so innocently weeks earlier. The same granite countertops and crown molding now carrying a weight none of us could have imagined that first afternoon. Detective Ford and his partner waited outside in an unmarked car, close enough to respond immediately, far enough not to alarm Whitney before Adam had the chance to speak first. She greeted us warmly at the door, entirely unsuspecting, commenting on how nice it was to see all three of us together, and I watched Adam's jaw tighten as he stepped past her into the living room without his usual easy affection, the first sign she seemed to register that something was wrong. "Adam, what's going on?" she asked, her smile beginning to falter as she looked between the three of us. "Sit down, Whitney," Adam said, his voice steadier than I think even he expected it to be. "We need to talk about the down payment on this house." I watched color drain slowly from her face as Adam laid it out, piece by piece, exactly as we'd rehearsed with Constance beforehand. The forged signature, the forensic report, the fabricated inheritance story, and finally the gambling debts Patricia's investigation had traced with such careful precision. Whitney's composure cracked somewhere around the mention of the gambling records, her hands beginning to shake as she reached for an explanation that clearly wasn't coming easily to her. "I was going to pay it back," she said, her voice rising into something desperate now. "I swear, Adam, I never meant for it to get this far. I got into trouble, real trouble, and I panicked, and your dad's power of attorney just happened to be sitting there, and I thought I could fix everything before anyone ever needed to know." "You forged my father's signature," Adam said, his voice breaking slightly on the word forged. "You put his house at risk. You let me believe a story about your dead grandmother for 2 years, Whitney. 2 years of gratitude I felt toward someone who never actually gave us anything." "I love you," Whitney said, tears streaming now, though I watched Raymond's face remain carefully composed, neither cruel nor forgiving, simply steady. "Everything else aside, Adam, please believe that part is real." "I don't know what to believe anymore," Adam said quietly, and it was at that moment, exactly as we'd planned with Detective Ford, that the front door opened and the two officers stepped inside, identifying themselves clearly, laying out the charges being filed as Whitney's protests dissolved into genuine, frightened silence. I won't describe every detail of what followed that afternoon. The particular indignity of watching someone taken into custody in the same living room where we'd admired countertops just weeks earlier. What I'll say is that it happened calmly, professionally, and that by the time it was over, Adam stood between his father and me on that same driveway, shaking but upright, having faced something none of us could have imagined walking into that housewarming party. The months that followed moved with the same slow, procedural rhythm every difficult legal process seems to carry. Whitney was formally charged with forgery, identity theft, and bank fraud, ultimately accepting a plea agreement that included restitution and a period of supervised probation, given her lack of prior criminal history and her eventual, if belated, cooperation once the evidence became undeniable. The fraudulent Hellick was discharged through the bank's own internal fraud investigation, combined with Constance's persistent advocacy, restoring our home to its rightful unencumbered status within 4 months. Adam filed for divorce the same week Whitney was formally charged, a decision he made, he told us, not out of anger alone but out of a clear-eyed understanding that whatever love had existed between them had been built on a foundation he could no longer trust enough to stand on. He moved back in with Raymond and me for what became nearly 6 months, longer than any of us initially expected, rebuilding not just his finances but something steadier in himself that I think had been missing quietly for longer than any of us had noticed before all of this began. I remember one evening several months into that arrangement finding Adam and Raymond together in the garage, Raymond patiently walking him through the basics of reading a loan document properly, the same careful, methodical skill that had ultimately saved all of us from a fraud none of us saw coming. "I don't ever want to be that unaware of my own finances again," Adam told his father that evening, and I watched something pass between them that felt like the truest kind of healing available to any of us after everything we'd been through, not forgetting what had happened but building something more solid in its place. Adam eventually bought a smaller, more modest house of his own, a year later paying for it honestly, slowly with his own careful savings rather than any borrowed convenience. He still comes to our house most Sundays, the same table where we once laid out the evidence that changed all of our lives, though these days we mostly just eat dinner together, ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way I once took for granted before that whispered warning at a party changed everything. I learned that love without honesty is simply a well-decorated lie, however beautiful the house it's built inside of looks from the outside. What I gained in the end wasn't only our own home's security, though that matters more than I can properly express. It was a son who chose the truth over comfort, and a family that grew closer facing a crisis together than we'd been in years of simply, comfortably drifting alongside each other. Proof, finally, that the family worth protecting is the one willing to face hard truths side by side, rather than the one that simply looks pleasant from across a beautifully decorated room.